Well, it's an honor to be back with you. John Halstead is actually one of Connie's and my closest friends and colleagues in this movement. And I'd like to speak this morning. John actually was the one that suggested using this title. I used this title twice over the last 5 years, but it's been a few years. And the title is Confessions of a Recovering Progressive. I've got, let's see, I can screen share. There we go. Okay. So Confessions of a Recovering Progressive. And I just have, I just learned this yesterday. I just figured this out yesterday that 30 years ago, last month actually, is when my first book, Earth Spirit, a handbook for nurturing an ecological Christianity, came out. And it has the same image that I'm using in my main evening programs now. But I want to offer, let's see if I can do this, minimize that. I want to offer a quote at the beginning from John Michael Greer, who wrote a book called The Retro Future, Looking to the Past to Reinvent the Future. And he says, when you're driving down a blind alley and are sitting there with your bumper pressed against a brick wall, the way forward, the only way to progress, starts by backing up. Revving the engine and hearing it labor and rattle as the gas gauge moves steadily toward that unwelcome letter E, or praying for a techno miracle are not particularly useful responses. I wanted to share that because, let's get back to my main screen here. Okay. Because this notion of being a recovering progressive, I mean, we think of the word recovering as, sort of addiction, or somebody that's been involved in a cult or whatever, and they've got themselves out. And what I've learned in the last 8 years, I'll share a little bit about my story, but what I've learned in the last 8 years is that pretty much all of us on this call, anybody who was born in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 1980s, the unspoken assumption, the invisible faith, the invisible religion, the secular religion of perpetual progress. It was just our experience because we had so much dense concentrated energy in the form of oil and so much material resources that things got better and easier and wealthier. And so we all grew accustomed to that secular faith of perpetual progress. And it's only been really recently that a large number of us are realizing that human-centered progress that counts as progress, the degradation of everything humans need to survive with, the air, water, soil, life, everything we depend upon, the stability of the climate and so on, is really a rather short-sighted and really insane notion of progress anyway. And so coming to terms with that, I mean, it's unspeakably, meaning that we can't give words to how painful it is when your faith is challenged or crumbles. And certainly I know that from 2016, when I started doing programs in liberal Christian churches and lots of Unitarian churches and that sort of thing, there was almost in shell shock, most progressives, because of course the word progress and progressives, people who believe in progress and carry, progressive values. I'll come back to that. With the previous election, it was just really challenging and seeing so many things being dismantled. And now, of course, it's been a little bit easier since this most recent election for some people to get back on that bandwagon of perpetual progress. And what most of us don't know, and I only learned recently, is that progress is always dependent upon energy. The complexity of any system, it doesn't have to be human civilizations, the complexity of any system is dependent upon the energy per capita, the energy per individual, per unit. And so we know of over 100 previous boom and bust, progress, regress, rise and fall of civilizations over the last 8,000 years. And most of them, the vast majority of them, it was when they used up too much timber, because that was the primary source of energy, human and animal muscle power and timber, trees. And when you used up all the trees and it was too expensive to go halfway across the world to get more trees, or the topsoil washed away, boom, the civilization collapsed. It's called overshooting how much we take from the living world and overshooting, using more and exuding more resources, so the system starts to break down. So this last 8 years has been a painful reckoning for me, because while in 1991, my book Earth Spirit, I still had a very ecological understanding, and I understood, I've been an environmentalist since the late 1980s or mid 1980s. But then in the year 2000, I read several books that put me on a techno-optimist bandwagon. And for about 12 and a half years, I had a Star Trek vision of the future, from the caves to now to the stars. And I thought of progress as being pretty much unending, that there was always, it could always, greater. Many times, I think the first time I probably spoke to your congregation 8 or 9 years ago, I still was very much in, or 9 years ago or longer, I was still very much in this greater complexity, interdependence, and cooperation at larger and wider scale. And I frankly thought that was never ending. And then on December, so from 2000, roughly 2000 to December 3rd of 2012, I had this more human-centered and more techno-optimist view of the future. And then on December 3rd of 2012, I woke up and there was an article, I think it was in the Atlantic, 5 climate charts that should have you really, really scared, or something like that. And I read the article, and there was a paragraph and a chart. And then at the very end, there was a TEDx talk by David Roberts called Climate Change is Simple. And it was the remix. Somebody had added some music to it. Climate Change is Simple, the remix. And it was David Roberts. And I was crushed. I watched his TED talk and I started crying. I woke Connie up. We both watched it. We were both brought to tears. That afternoon, I bought from Amazon Prime, Al Gore's The Future, James Hansen's Storms of My Grandchildren, and about a half a dozen other books related to climate. And I started studying climate change. And Connie and I became climate activists. And in 2014, we supported the Great March for Climate Action. And we took 8 months going from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. There were about 50 marchers that marched 14 miles a day. And we were speaking in churches and colleges along that route for 8 months in 2014. And then we were joining other rallies and protests and marches and stuff. And I continued to spend 20 or 30, sometimes 40 hours a week studying the rise and fall of civilization, studying energy and understanding how primary energy is, and also studying climate change and abrupt climate change. And my sense of perpetual progress really completely died in 2013 and 14. And then in January of 2015, I read William Catton's book, Overshoot, The Ecological Basis of Revolutionary Change. Single most important book I've ever read in my life. It helped me make sense of the entirety of human history and our relationship to the planet, and the profound differences, and simple differences, but profound in terms of the foundation between truly sustainable, genuinely sustainable cultures, like indigenous cultures. Think of Dances with Wolves as a good example of the Stone Age. Stone Age doesn't mean caves. It means living in a sustainable, in a mutually enhancing way, where everything that you need for your shelter, for your food, for transportation, for everything else, is done in a way that preserves the well-being of the ecosphere, the well-being of the land, the water, the soil, the forests. That's a preserving culture, what Daniel Quinn called leaver, as opposed to taker cultures. And there's just a few basic sort of laws of sustainability. One of them is treat the living world as if it's God, as a greater thou, not a lesser it. That sense of humility, the fundamental stance of truly sustainable, I came to find out, is the stance of we belong to the land. The fundamental stance of unsustainable is the land belongs to us. And it's a profound difference in values. So the last 8 years, I've been studying all this and been trying to educate and share. And I did 77 post-doom conversations. I talked a little bit about that last year when John invited me. I think we were in Eureka, California at the time. And these are conversations, they're all freely available, both in audio and video, postdoom.com. But there's people who get the big picture. Many of us, the vast majority of us, 10 years ago would have called ourselves progressive, and we still hold, indigenous, heartful, responsible values, inclusive values. But now we've also recognized that progress is never everlasting. It's never eternal. It's always dependent upon energy and resources, and it depends upon how we impact the living world. And so I want to bring this little sermonette or a little homily or whatever to completion on the notion of what can we do, given the fact that we are now living in a world where for literally 200 years, the biosphere has been degrading. And the last 20 years or so, it's been in, or 20 to 50 years, it's been in precipitous free fall. So the fish, the insects, we would just watch something the other night called Insectageddon, and it was about the insect apocalypse, and it was just terribly depressing. It was sponsored by Extinction Rebellion, but it doesn't matter what system you look at. Every single system and everything that humans depend upon for our survival and thrival is not just in gentle decline, it's in now free fall. It's in exponential collapse. So it's only a matter of time before we see societal collapse. In fact, many parts of the world, there's already strong evidence it's collapsing as we speak. But for those of us in the privileged first world, as it's called, the overdeveloped world, it hasn't touched many of us personally yet, although sometimes our family members and others that we know of. And now, of course, with COVID and everything else. And so let me slow down. It's a time to really prioritize what matters most, which is the healthy relationships. We can all be of service, even though we're not going to transform the world. That's another thing that's really been difficult for progressives to accept, is that there's never, ever, we know of over 100 unsustainable extractive civilizations, and not one has ever become sustainable. It basically crashes. It takes many decades, but, and then something new can emerge. And so how do we be in a world where our climate is unraveling, the jet stream is unraveling, we're seeing periods of hot and cold and drought, and there are some things that are inevitable, meaning that if all humans went extinct tonight, or if everybody woke up tomorrow morning with an enlightened epiphany to live ecologically, there's certain things that are already out of our control, such as the forests of the world burning. The majority of the forests in the world over the next decade or 2 or 3 are going to be burning, and it's going to get worse every year. And that's already out of our control. The loss of the corals and so on. I'm not going to give a litany of bad news because we don't need that. It's just depressing. But how do we shepherd? How do we redeem and shepherd progressive values of inclusion, values of compassion, values of generosity, values of sustainability? Just because we can't make industrial civilization sustainable doesn't mean that each and every one of us can't make choices in our families and in our communities to lessen, to use less energy, drive less, fly less, eat less meat. We can all downscale, get off the, less screen time. John Michael Greer, the author I quoted before, he's got one of his books is called Collapse Now and Avoid the Rush. And, so how do we maintain a heart of joy and of love, even in degrading times? Because that's what we're in. Things don't typically collapse this way. They collapse in a stair step and in partial recoveries. That's the way the vast majority of civilizations in the past and empires have collapsed. So how to maintain spiritual values, progressive values, how do we shepherd them? And how can we continue to keep a joyful, compassionate, generous heart in increasingly challenging times? That's going to be the spiritual practice, I think, for all of us. And that's what all these post-doom conversations that I've had are all about. Basically doing the grief work, doing the feeling work that we all have to do, unless we stay in denial, and then come through to a post-doom place of inspired local action, generous, compassionate contribution, and where the blame game that's so easy to do when you don't understand the big picture, it's so easy to blame. And that's, again, what we see in previous collapsing civilizations. We see in-groups tighten up, and a lot of blame goes around. And of course, the media and powerful corporations are all too happy to feed that. So how do we avoid that? How do we find compassion for those that we blamed last year or 3 years ago? And then how do we gain clarity to live life fully and love the life we live and be the biggest blessing that we can be to our communities and our friends and our neighbors, even in contracting times, because that's a fact. We're in contracting times. And in times of carrying capacity surplus, where there's more than enough energy, more than enough resources, liberal values tend to predominate. And in times of carrying capacity, what's the word, Connie? Carrying capacity, surplus and I don't know. Anyway, when there's not enough energy, not enough resources, conservative values tend to predominate. So those of us who hold liberal values or progressive values and are proud to do so, it's going to take intention and heartful energy to continue to shepherd them, because it's not going to happen. The environment's not going to be selecting for that easy. So it's going to really require those of us being committed to ensuring those values pass into the future. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to recognize that as Unitarian Universalists, our faith isn't necessarily in progress. Our faith is in love, in ecological sustainability, in generosity, in inclusion at larger scale rather than judgment and tightening. And so I think we have the potential as Unitarian Universalists to play, dare I say, prophetic role in these difficult times, and to be I think we're in the early stages of the greatest mental health crisis in human history, as more and more people realize that we're not going to live on Mars, no matter what Elon Musk thinks, and we're not going to transform the global capitalist industrial world and become sustainable. That's a bitter, bitter pill to swallow. And so I think that for us to do the heart work, support each other as being an example in our communities, it's holy work. And then also to do whatever we can to build topsoil, to support other species, because just because we can't save everything, just because we can't transform everything, doesn't mean that there's not profound, great work that we can be engaged in, that nourishes our souls, that blesses others, including more than human others, and that is an example of the best of Unitarian Universalism. And so I'd like to close with a quote that I love from the amazing, I'm going to do screen share again, amazing Native American plant scientist, Robin Wall Kimmerer. By the way, this is Connie and I. She took this picture when we were out in the redwoods, and a lot of people don't know that the redwood forests are in collapse. You won't know that unless you understand what collapse looks like from a biospheric perspective. But these great redwoods, these giant redwoods, are not producing cones, except they're not producing babies, except where they're artificially watered, because there's now much less fog and much less rain. Action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, it's not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. Amen.